Welcome to episode number 5 of the Voices of Boyle podcast. Today I'm speaking with Gordon Ryan, who has had a very different life than most of us. Back when he was a baby, Gordon was diagnosed with a genetic condition called cystic fibrosis. It wasn't until he was in his early 20s that cystic fibrosis started to affect his health. As a result, in 2013, he had no option but to have a double lung transplant. In this episode, we talk about what his life was like on a daily basis in the lead up to the transplant, and then we also touch base on what his life was like post-transplant. It's a very insightful look through the eyes of someone who has dealt with cystic fibrosis for a number of years and also who has gone through a major transplant in the process. I hope you enjoy listening to the episode. It did go on a little longer than we had planned, but due to the nature of the topic, we decided we'd give it the time that it deserved. Gordon, welcome to the podcast. How are you keeping?
Very well, thank you, Carlo.
Listen,
thank you for having me on.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure. Look, you have a very different life story to most of us, and we're going to get into that in a few minutes. But before that, why don't you tell us a bit about where you were born and where you grew up?
Yeah, so I was born in Coothall, Carlo, in Ardcarn specifically, and grew up in that area. And I went to school in primary school in Coothall, and my parents there, my dad was a teacher and they had a guest house as well, so we were busy with that during the summer. And then I came into Boyle for secondary school.
That's where I remember from, yeah.
And I met you there.
Yeah.
And
growing up in Boyle, you're of the same age as myself, so growing up in Boyle, memory-wise, for me, I'd have a very strong memories of the hot air balloons and the gala festivals. What would you have any memories relating to those from your time?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Definitely for me the hot air ballooning championships stand out in the early 90s. Now I think it was, wasn't it? It was spectacular, really, and it brought such colour and such excitement to the area, and we kept some of the ballooning teams
in our
guest house,
right.
Yeah. And I remember one year we had the Club Orange balloon team staying with us, and I got to go up as well. I got to go up twice in a hot air balloon, and it's kind of a once in a life experience. When you look back on that now, it kind of seems crazy to be that high in the sky with no harness or anything really protecting you.
Just there.
And you're just looking out over this
and the
basket,
silence as well,
which is just up to under your chest, and the silence, and just to see the world from up there. It's kind of something you can't describe until you experience it. So I have great memories of that whole time and the excitement every year, when that came around. And I remember going into school and you'd see the balloons up in the morning, and they're great memories. And
it was typical of a September morning because it was in September. They always came around this time of year, actually.
It was, yeah.
And they used to, on a crisp September morning, I remember walking down to the boys' school and you'd hear in the distance the
yeah.
It was great, just childhood memory.
It's a noise that stays with you, isn't it? The firing up the balloons. And
it does indeed, yeah. Any other kind of standout memory that, before we kind of get into the
Yeah, I remember Boyle was kind of our town. We were between Boyle and Carrick, but we leaned more towards Boyle. And we did all our shopping, came into Boyle regularly. And I have great memories of going into, obviously I went into many of the shops, but in particular, Christy Wynn's shop stands out for me. And that really was something you looked forward to. And I really hit it off with Christy because we had a shared interest in snooker. And Christy used to get tickets for Goffs at the time. The Irish Snooker Championship was held there, and we had that in common. And then, of course, his sweet selection was
and magazine collection.
Nothing could compare to that. Yeah, and it was just a great little spot. And Christy, of course, an absolute gentleman, and his ability to relate to anybody and to relate to young people at that time was extraordinary and stands out for me as a great memory. Yes. And also looking back on that time, the number of newsagents around the town, you know, you could go into McDonough's, the Bazaar was another one. And they were places where people talked and had conversations from my recollection. And you wouldn't just go in and go out. You'd go in and you could be in there for half an hour having a conversation, you know, with Christy or Frank Feehan or Rosemary Moran at the time. And yeah, they were all great memories. I just remember Boyle being a very busy place. You know, we had the cinema then, and as a young boy, I enjoyed going there. That was a real occasion before it burnt. And then the fact we had all the hotels, and I don't think we realised then growing up in Boyle how good we had it.
Yeah.
You know, and we just didn't. And when you look back the last, I suppose, 20 years and the absence of those places, you know, it has been a shame to see that happen, but there were great memories back in those days. And the Royal Hotel was another place we frequented, and I had my confirmation meal there, and that was a great memory.
There's not too many families in Boyle, I think, back in those days that wouldn't have had some family event at some stage in the Royal.
Absolutely, yeah. And then another thing, Carlo, too, which you'd remember as well, were the nightclubs.
Ah, yes.
You know, like
right beside
Parker's back in the day, and Cleo's nightclub as well.
Yeah.
And you know, to be able to go in there for people at that time was really fantastic in a small town. So,
as you said,
so hopefully
Boyle,
we'll see them back again, and some guys.
Yeah, as you said, Boyle back in those days was a very vibrant, lively place.
Yeah.
And obviously with the progression of time then it's kind of dwindled to what it is today. But you know, the result, Boyle is a lovely town. It's great and it has huge potential.
It has massive potential, and I feel there will be a resurgence in Boyle. That it has diminished over the years for different reasons. You know, we saw Carrick taken over with a lot of businesses moving there, and the bigger stores and so on. And then the bypass too was a big difficulty for here. But I think now with a lot of people moving down the country, and you can see that around Boyle in the last year or two, there are a lot of new faces and there are a lot of things happening, like the tennis club in Boyle, for instance, has taken off, and the golf is as busy as ever, and loads of other sports and interests for people.
Yeah.
So it will come round again.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great couple of little memories just to kick things off. I suppose, obviously, the main bulk of our chat today, Gordon, is going to be around your story and what has happened over the past couple of years for you. So, to give people a quick kind of snapshot, you were diagnosed as a baby with cystic fibrosis. For anyone that doesn't know what cystic fibrosis is, it's a genetic disease that you inherit a faulty gene from each parent. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong at any stage in this, Gordon, and what happens is you lack a protein that regulates the salt and water in the cells of the lungs. And as a result, that creates the excess salt causes a sticky mucus to form in the lungs, which can then cause infection. And as a result, eventually, when your lung function gets so low, you eventually need a lung transplant.
Yes, you've summarised it there perfectly, Carlo. It also, as well as the respiratory system, it also affects the digestive system, and it can affect other systems in the body too. But the main issue are the lungs, like you say. So you get this sticky mucus, and what that does is it, instead of lubricating the cells, it actually blocks them and causes infections then, and you get repeated lung infections. So over time, people's lungs get scarred with the illness and their lung function declines gradually. Now, it's quite progressive, and everyone's pattern of illness is different with the condition. But yeah, that's more or less it. And like you say, to be born with cystic fibrosis, you have to inherit the gene from each parent. So in Ireland, 1 in 23 people will carry the CF gene. Now, a person carrying the CF gene will not realise that they're carrying it. But if two people come together and have a child and they both carry the gene, then there's a 1 in 4 chance that the child will be born with cystic fibrosis. And that's where I found myself.
1 in 4 if they...
Yes, for each child. So each time they have a child, that 1 in 4 chance persists. Now, I have one sister and she doesn't have it, no. But she did get tested when she was having children herself in the last couple of years, and she's a carrier. She's a carrier? Yeah, but her partner isn't a carrier, so they had no worries. Okay, yeah, right. And I've seen it in families over the years, Carlo, where, you know, more than one child would have CF, and that's quite tragic, where, you know, you can have 2, 3, 4 children within a family with cystic fibrosis and very sick with it, and, you know, potentially dying then as well. Yeah.
So bring us back to maybe when you first started feeling the effects of cystic fibrosis. I presume you led a normal kind of adolescent life up until your 20s, and then it kind of stuck its ugly head out. Is that correct? Yeah,
that sums it up quite well. I was lucky in that sense. I had a very normal upbringing, which continued right through my teens. I suppose I knew I had something, but I didn't know what it was. Like, my parents used to say to me, "Oh, you have to look after yourself. You've a chest condition, and you know you need to be careful." But they didn't wrap me up in cotton wool,
right.
and that's not the case with a lot of families where CF exists. And I think looking back on it, that stood to me. You know, I was able to go to school. I was able to run around and play football in school. Now, I wasn't as good as you on the football pitch, I remember. But I kind of didn't realise myself I was limited with this condition. I was running as fast as I could, but it was never going to match others. But that normal upbringing definitely stood to me, and I was lucky I didn't experience hospitalisation with the condition until I got into my early 20s, like you said.
Yeah, and then how did those symptoms manifest themselves? Did they start, was it out of breath all of a sudden, or was it a slow kind of progression? Did you feel that this chest infection that your parents were telling you about when you were young, this is starting to come about now a little bit more aggressively?
Yeah, I was starting to feel breathless and also coughing a lot more. And with cystic fibrosis, you have a lot of mucus there, and when that gets infected, then it can be quite nasty, so you're having to cough that up. And I wasn't at the time looking after myself, as the medical team always referred to, because I'd never been sick, so I didn't think I needed to do anything in terms of clearing out that mucus. So people with cystic fibrosis regularly need to do their own type of physiotherapy, where they use breathing exercise to move the mucus up out of the lungs and cough it out. Now, when I was a child, the treatment back then was that the parents would clap children on the back to actually shift the mucus, but that changed over the years as they got more advanced. Initially at the time when I started to get quite sick there when I was about 21 or 2, I wasn't doing anything to help myself because I just didn't realise, that I really needed to. And I got quite bad lung infection and found myself in St Vincent's University Hospital in Dublin, which is where they have the adult centre, the National Centre for adults with cystic fibrosis. And that was a whole new world to me because I didn't want to know. And there I was in hospital sick. I was put on intravenous antibiotics, and I had this whole team swamping me with information. I had physiotherapists coming into me every day and wanting to teach me these new breathing exercises, which were quite arduous. You had to really put a lot of effort in doing them to help cough out the mucus, and I just didn't want to know at the time. And it was difficult because I'd been used to being well for so long that I just thought, okay, I'll get whatever treatment I need to get here now, get the antibiotics, do all that, and then I'll get out and I'll get on with normal life. And that's the experience for most patients in hospital who found themselves in hospital sick. They get treated, they get looked after, and they go home and life moves on. But I remember a really good nurse saying to me, she said, "Well, you have to remember, Gordon, you can't just leave the door here and forget about it. The chances are you're going to be back here again. And I was like, what's she talking about? But her words, were true. And that was the experience then over the next few years.
So you first went into hospital 2002?
Yeah, January 2002.
And then over the following 4 or 5 years, I presume you were in and out of hospital, multiple infections.
Yeah, things progressed then. Now, I wasn't in a huge amount initially, like 2002 to 2005 or 6, maybe 3 to 4 times a year. I was managing to work at the time in Dublin, and but things kind of reached a head then around 2008. But it was a gradual process. So the early years, I found myself in and out, and not really accepting it. I'd go into hospital. I was like, I really don't want to be here. I don't want to know about this. Just want to get out and lead a normal life. And that's all people with cystic fibrosis ever want, is to be able to live a normal life. But it doesn't work like that. I remember somebody saying to me, well, there's 3 of you now in this situation. There's you, there's your life in terms of your work, your job, friends, all of that. And then there's your cystic fibrosis. So I had to really allow for that and take on board everything I was being told and learn how to look after myself. I had been lucky, I suppose, Carlo, that I had escaped being sick with it up to then. And it's a very individual illness. I mean, some people with cystic fibrosis won't get sick until they're well into their 20s or 30s. But I met so many people who were sick since they were children. And that's a common pattern for a lot of people. And they didn't know any different. But, I had this normal life up to then, and that was now gone. And that took a lot of acceptance, over those few years to realise that and to actually do something about, helping myself.
Yeah, I'd say so. And as you said, you probably felt it was a rotten hand to be dealt, this, consistent hospital visits. And at that stage, even maybe up towards 2008, had you fully realised that this is when did you kind of get to the stage where you realised that this was something that potentially is going to be fatal at some stage unless you get a transplant, for example? Is there any time that you kind of felt the penny dropped? Was it when that nurse said that you have to kind of look after yourself and that it doesn't, that you'll never get rid of? There's no cure, obviously, for cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, no, there's no cure for it. No, it would have been a few years after she said that. She said that in during my early admissions. Right. I think it was over, multiple visits into hospital that I gradually realised what I was dealing with. And it was seeing other people, really, other people in hospital. Now, I know in hospital you see the worst of the worst, but there were other people with CF who were dying in hospital, and I was hearing more about transplant. So it was kind of strange because you wanted to know more, but you didn't really want to know. And it kind of seeped in over, 4 to 5 years. And in the meantime, I was getting worse without fully realising it. And when you ask about transplant, that's not something you ever think about, because you don't want to have a transplant. But I was hearing about other people having transplants, and I did wonder, would it happen to me? But I kind of had myself convinced that because I had been so well up to the age of 21 or 2, that meant I had a head start. And it's like a fool's paradise. I thought, well, I won't need a transplant until I'm well into my 40s. But it doesn't work like that. I mean, people can gradually get worse over a long period of time. And I saw people who went downhill in the space of a year or 2 and needed a transplant. So it was a gradual process, and I knew I was getting sicker. So when it was eventually suggested to me, I wasn't that shocked, but
you still were.
I didn't
a
want
realization that there's no way kind of other than a transplant.
Yeah, well, that was it. They don't recommend to you that you need a double lung transplant with CF until you're at the stage where they think you will live longer with a transplant than you will if you keep going battling your CF without it. So that certainly it did come as a shock. Yeah, no matter how much you knew or thought it might happen down the road, I didn't think it would come so soon. That was a big shock.
What was your day-to-day life like in the lead up to the time? We can talk about the actual how the transplant came about, but were you taking a lot of medication? Were you on nebulizers, ventilators, any of that? Like, I presume you were on all of those things on a daily basis.
I was, yeah. Well, people with CF are on a heavy regime, so they have to take antibiotics. They have to take digestive enzymes, because as I said, the digestive system is affected as well, so that helps digest food. But also nebulizers to help clear the airways, and then you had to do this physiotherapy. And as you were gradually getting worse and your lung function was getting worse, the infections were increasing. So I found the lung infections were getting harder to clear. So, and of course, I wasn't somebody to go into hospital straight away when I'd start feeling sick. But every time I got a cold, it developed into a nasty lung infection. But I was always delaying the inevitable until I realised I'd nowhere else to go in. But you were looking at longer admissions as the infections got more complicated, and your ability to resist the infection and to fight it was wilting because your lung function was declining. So it's progressive in that sense that the lungs are getting scarred, your lung function is getting less, and it's like you're kind of having to just keep running to stand still.
Yeah.
And it's a vicious circle. There's no way around that. You're just battling the odds.
You were on a waiting list, or you had to be on a waiting list. Was that in Ireland?
Well, I was initially assessed, so it was around 2008. As I said, it came quite quickly. I had 6 years of in and out of hospital and things getting worse. And then it was around the end of 2008 it was first mentioned to me and about being assessed. And people don't often realise that, you just don't click your fingers and get the transplant. It is a very long process. You have to be assessed. And, there are a lot of people who unfortunately don't get the opportunity to go on the list because
there's no match.
Well, no, it's initially to go on the list, you have to be, at the time you're very sick, but you have to be sick enough to need the transplant, but you have to kind of be robust enough in another sense that they think you'll get through it. So what I mean by that is, your other organs in your body, like I had to go through a whole platter of tests. So I had liver function tests, I had cardiac, I had kidney function, all of that. So if those other systems are damaged in the body, you might not get on the list, and your weight has to be good enough too. And a lot of people over the years have been very sick with a lost weight, and they already had that inbuilt deficiency, that difficulty of putting on weight. So they won't recommend you go on the list unless you've been assessed and you've kind of got through all those hoops. So it's not an automatic thing that people just get to go on the list, and that takes time. And that's the big challenge, that you don't know how much time you have left when you're at that end stage of CF, where you're really struggling to breathe. You're on oxygen perhaps, which I was for 2 years before my transplant. So you can't predict the future. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and time is the big enemy, because you might not live long enough to get the transplant. But giving yourself the best chance is definitely the way to go. Yeah. So after being assessed, it took a bit of time, but I was initially placed on the English list, and the reason for that is we only started doing double lung transplants or single lung transplants in Ireland around 2007 in the matter. And like, they were only getting going at the time. They were only starting, and anyone who I'd ever come across who needed a transplant with CF had it in Newcastle. So I felt at that time my best chance of getting the transplant was in Newcastle, not Dublin. I kind of felt, well, if I go on the Dublin list, they've hardly done anything yet here, and I don't kind of want to be a pawn in that game. And, you know, you were looking at Newcastle, they'd been doing it for 15 years at that stage. They had the best transplant team, and there were so many successful Irish transplants done over there. So it made sense at the time to go on the Newcastle list, which I did eventually. I was placed on the list on the 1st of June 2010.
When it got to the stage your lung function was deteriorating at a stage, to a level that it was inevitable that you needed a transplant, that was around 2012, 2013, was it?
No, it was before that. It was around 2008.
Okay, that it was inevitable.
Yeah, but I had to be assessed initially before going on the list, and then I was assessed the following year. But there was a delay at the time. I'm not sure what the delay was with going on the English list. They had to do all the tests, and you see, the English team used to come over to Dublin to see the Irish patients. So you weren't in regular contact with them. They would come over every few months. So it kind of was a drawn out process, and you had to get all your tests done, and they had to be fully happy. So it took about 14 months from the point of assessment to actually get on the list. Yeah.
And your lung function, it decreases every year then, as you were saying, from 2008 it was slowly decreasing. What was it just at the time of your transplant? What was the percentage?
It was rock bottom. Just the last time it was tested, it was 12%, and at that stage I was fully oxygen dependent.
24/7, was it?
Yeah. And they do this lung function test, which it's a big barometer in cystic fibrosis for them to gauge where your lungs are at. But generally speaking, once your lung function goes under 30%, they look at you as potentially needing a transplant, and then they will, advise you accordingly and get you assessed. So when it was first suggested to me around 2008, I think my lung function was about 26%, and then it just kept going down until the last time, and that was actually about a year before my transplant. It was 12%. So then they said, we're not going to test it anymore because
no point.
It can't go any much lower.
So on a day-to-day basis then, you weren't able to do anything? No, not even maybe going up for a walk? Was it that bad that...
I was very limited, in the last... Really since from the point of going on the list, quality of life was very poor. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day, is quality of life, which really determined my decision to go on the list. I couldn't work. I mean, I wasn't able to work. I was oxygen dependent. When I wasn't at home, I was in hospital. And I remember a cousin of mine saying to me, how do you cope when you're at home? Do you get bored? And this was when I was on the list. And I kind of didn't know how to answer him, only to say, well, I have to look after myself and I keep myself busy. But it was only actually a few years later then, after the fact, that I knew the answer, which was I didn't have the energy to be bored, because when you're so sick and you're struggling to get your breath and just to do the basic day-to-day stuff, you don't have the energy to be bored. So it was really just pottering around the house, get out maybe for a short walk. But I'll be honest, I mean, when you're on oxygen, you don't want people to see you. And I think that was the most difficult thing, looking back on it now. Cystic fibrosis is a very deceptive illness. You can meet someone with CF in the morning and you won't know they have it, because they might look absolutely fine. as a friend of mine with CF always said, well, they can't see your lungs, can they?
True, yeah.
You know, so you might think there's nothing wrong with them. So it's quite an invisible illness in that way. But once you get to the point where you're having to wear oxygen, the game is up. You know, you can't pretend to yourself anymore, well, I'm not too bad, or I'm still living a normal life, because try going out with oxygen.
You're on the clock.
Everyone's looking at you, and, you know, you kind of know it yourself. And I remember being at a cousin's wedding in Dublin, and at the time I was on the list, and I had just gone on the oxygen, and I had to wear the oxygen to go to the wedding. And it was the afters of the wedding. I wasn't well enough to go for the full day. And I didn't want to wear it, but I knew I had no choice. And it was like, he was a great friend of mine and had come into me in hospital as well as being my cousin. So in the end, I went out and wore the oxygen. I remember being up at the bar getting a drink, and there was a group of girls. I was like, well, I've no business talking to them. You know, you're just so limited with it. And one of them came over to me and she was like, what's wrong with you?
Typical.
And I just went back to the hospital that night, and it was like, God, where, you know, what sort of a life is this? You know, so going back to what you said earlier about, you know, what did I do to deserve this? That was there all along over those years, you know, because my friends were moving along with their lives. You know, they were developing their careers, they were travelling the world, you know, they were meeting partners, getting married, some of them having families. And there was I, like, battling this illness for what? Like, what did I do to deserve this? Yeah. You know, but getting sorry for yourself, it won't bring you anywhere. And I suppose I was lucky enough, I was able to get by that and not get trapped in it, because, you know, it's just wasted energy. At the end of the day, we can't control our lives. And I think COVID, you know, woke people up to that reality that we don't control everything. And living with cystic fibrosis, you don't have control. You know, you can only control your attitude and do what you can to help yourself. It's really like being trapped in a sick person's body. You're trapped, and there's nothing you can do about that. So you have to live with that and try to do what you can to help yourself.
So, Gordon, my next question would be in relation to the years, or even the year leading up to before you got the transplant, when you actually realised that if I don't get this transplant, or if it doesn't come soon enough, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to die. That's just an inevitability with the illness. How did contemplating your death or mortality on a daily basis affect you mentally? It obviously had to take a real, you know, a lot out of you on a day-to-day basis, thinking these thoughts that are a certainty if you didn't get this transplant. Yeah,
it was definitely there, Carlo. I mean, everyone in that situation naturally thinks about that. I tried not to think that much about it. I mean, as I said earlier, I couldn't control the outcome, so
you could only control.
I mean, I remember being in the room in Vincent's Hospital. At that stage, we had proper facilities for people with CF. We had single ensuite rooms, which weren't there for years. I remember my room looked out onto the golf course in Elm Park in Dublin, and I used to look out there and, you know, look out at people playing golf. I used to think, God, I'd love to be able to do that. You know, that's where I was. That was the situation, and, you know, I kind of realized, I did realize that might not happen.
Yeah,
it got me down. Like, I mean, you're stuck in hospital. We were quite isolated in hospital too, because we were all in our own rooms. And at that time, the rule which still applies is that we couldn't mix with each other. Now, I was too sick to be mixing with too many anyway, but people with CF, for reasons of cross-infection, it was better that we not, you know, mix and be too close to each other physically. Something like the whole COVID thinking, that type of thinking. So you were really there in a very grim situation. And I used to think, God, if I was in prison, it'd be better than this, because the food would be nicer and I wouldn't be sick and I wouldn't be on oxygen. But I tried not to. I mean, I tried not to go there, because it doesn't. It's not going to help the situation. And I mean, I did think about it, and I had got to know a lot of people over the years who died, and that was difficult, seeing other people.
So you would have become friends with people,
patients,
over the years.
Yeah, well, in the earlier years when we went in, there were no facilities, so there were no single ensuite rooms. So, you know, even though that was the standard of care in other countries, and here we were in Ireland with the highest rate of CF, and at the time the Celtic Tiger was in full flow. You had hotels going up everywhere and loads of things happening, but nothing being done like that in the health system for people with CF. And we then had to campaign and go on the Joe Duffy show to make all that happen, which it did eventually. But in those early years, the one big positive of it, looking back, was that we were free to mix with each other and socialise. And I did make a lot of friends with CF who I'm still in contact with. And many of them too, unfortunately, passed away. And there was one friend of mine, I'll just recall this story, who I got very friendly with in hospital. Like, these were kind of unusual friendships, because you were hanging out in hospital together, and that's the thing. People with CF are all young. We're all in our 20s, 30s. You wouldn't meet someone with CF in their 60s or 70s. Right. It just didn't happen. And we'd have pizza at night in the hospital out at the front and all that. And there was a girl I got very friendly with. Her name was Marie. And at that time we were both getting sicker, and we both realised it. And we used to talk about transplant. And, luckily I was always wanting to get the transplant if I got the opportunity, because, I knew what it was like to live a normal life, and that, upbringing and, the luck I had in not being sick as a child and as a teenager stood to me then, because I wanted to get back to that. But I remember chatting to Marie about it, and she didn't, and she wasn't the only one in this situation. There were a lot of people who felt it wasn't the decision for them. And she used to say to me, well, it's somebody else's lungs, isn't it? And I'd say to her, well, yeah, but if it's going to help you have a normal life and have a better quality of life, why not go for it? And she just wasn't that comfortable with the idea. Now, she had been very sick since she was young. So her experience of CF had been, constantly in and out of hospital since she was a young child. But anyway, long story short, she then got pregnant a year later, and she'd been going out with a guy for about 12 or 14 years. So it was a real surprise to her that she was pregnant. And I mean, I still will never get over her having that child, because we were both at that similar stage where her lung function was down in its early 20s. But they looked after her really well and in the hospital, and she had a baby boy. But that pregnancy and birth took so much out of her that her health went downhill very quickly after having the child. But I remember we were in contact all the time. Like, we used to talk on phone and text each other. And she rang me one night and she said, I have great news, you'll be surprised. And I said, what's this? What's the news? She said, I've decided to go on the transplant list. And I couldn't believe it, because she had been so against it for so long. And I said, well, why? What changed your mind? And it was quite poignant, like her little boy, Connor. She just said, well, I want to be able to keep up with Connor in the park. He was, at that stage, he was about 1.5, or he was walking. And, she then had to be assessed like I did. And she was at that stage where she was in hospital all the time. I was kind of in and out, between home and hospital. And she was just getting worse and worse. And she just ran out of time then. She got assessed and was about to be placed on the list when she just got worse and died. And like, she was only 28 at the time. It's about 12 years ago now. I left behind a husband and a baby boy. So like that's the reality of it. And, I often think of her because, I often think of that child and how she didn't get the opportunity that I got and others got. And, it was very unfair really, but it's a lottery. People often don't realise that transplant is a lottery. People used to say to me, when will you get your transplant? I'd say, well, you've as good an idea as I do because I don't know. I mean, you have to have the right match.
Blood type, antibodies,
it has
I
to
presume.
be similar, same blood type. Antibodies have to be right. If you have too many antibodies, it can be an issue. And that was a problem for me with Newcastle. They said I had too many antibodies and I wasn't getting called over then too much for a transplant. So there are a lot of things that have to be right. And you need to keep yourself going. You need to be just still, able to get through that. So there's a lot of things in the air with it really. And unfortunately for Marie, that decision she made, to change her mind
Was too late.
She wanted it, but there wasn't enough time. She had to be assessed and she didn't even get on the list in the end.
You had 14 months of an assessment period.
I had.
And she didn't have that time.
She didn't have that time. And then even when I got on the list, I was over 3 years on the list.
Yeah.
And I know of cases of other people who were 5-6 years on the list. Some were a few months. So every case is different, really.
So let's get to the actual, when your time came for a transplant. How did that come about? Where was it in you were on the waiting list in Newcastle?
Yeah, so I went on the Newcastle list on the 1st of June 2010, and then I got a call over there. It was the following year we got a call to go over, and at the time the way it worked was Newcastle would fly patients in a small little aircraft. So down we went to Sligo Airport. There was my mum, my sister and I, and we were flown over to Newcastle and straight to the hospital, and the transplant coordinator was in and out telling us what was happening, and they did bloods and so on, and like I thought, is it going ahead now? I wasn't sure. And then she came back into the room later to say, well, unfortunately, the match isn't fully right. And we have somebody else who's sicker than you, so it won't be going ahead for you tonight. And it was disappointing, but for me personally at that time, I kind of felt relieved because, as someone said to me, I kind of couldn't verbalise it myself until somebody said to me, well, did you feel that you weren't sick enough for it? Because I was on the transplant list, so by any measure I was sick enough. But I think it was that I felt I had more in the tank. I wasn't on oxygen at that stage, and, it was a case of feeling I don't want to get it too soon. Now, that's a hard one to explain, if you're not in the situation, but I kind of felt I can keep going here for another while. So I wasn't really distraught when it didn't go ahead because, as I said earlier, you're facing into a massive operation where, your chest is opened up and so on, and your lungs are taken out and 2 new lungs put in. So, I mean, it's not something you go into lightly. So I was kind of relieved that it wasn't going ahead at that point. But then you're weighing that against the other scenario of, well, what if I get worse and I mightn't get another call? So it's like quicksand. You don't know where you are. You're just
rock in a hard place kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But back we came, back home again, and struggled on for another while. And as time went on, I noticed Newcastle, they weren't calling me again. And there was this issue about my antibodies. So the way that works is if you have too many antibodies, it's not a good thing with transplants. So they kept saying, well, you have too many antibodies, so that makes it harder to get an exact match. And then they proposed that I move to Newcastle. So, like, that was massive. I mean, moving to Newcastle, it was, it wasn't, I didn't really want to do that. And I mean, if they were saying to me, well, move to Newcastle and we guarantee you get a transplant in 2 months, then maybe, but you could be over there forever and not get it. And then, the hospital was like a second home. I knew all the nurses, I had friends who were in there as well. And, I kind of had the run of the place in a way. And I was like, well, if I really thought to myself, well, if I'm going to get worse, and this is coming back to what you asked me earlier about, thinking about dying and mortality. And I certainly did think to myself, well, if I'm going to get worse here and I'm going to find myself, on my last legs and at the point where I'm going to die, I want to do that here in Dublin, in a hospital where I know everyone, I'm comfortable, and I've all my family and friends. Because you go over to Newcastle, sure, my friends weren't going to be in, my relatives, my immediate family would be there, obviously, but it just wasn't. It wasn't.
Didn't sit right with you.
Didn't sit with me at all. But there was the hope that it would still happen, and I continued on. But as we kind of got into 2012, I remember thinking, God, I haven't had another call here. There's nothing happening. And at that time, the Mater Hospital were really starting to take off. Now, 4 years previously, they were only getting going. But now they were doing a significant number of double lung transplants, like they were doing at the time around 16 to 20, I think. And I kind of thought, yeah, that's a real option now. Things are changing. So I asked for a meeting with Professor Jim Egan, who was the transplant physician for the Mater, and he came over to me, and I said to him, I want to get assessed now for I'm interested in going on to the Irish list. And he said, well, you'll have to get assessed first. It's like, assessed again? Here we go again. So I then had to be assessed for the Irish list. The fact that I had been assessed previously for Newcastle, and in fact I had 2 assessments, because I was assessed initially in the Mater before I went over to Newcastle to be assessed, because the Mater and Newcastle had that connection. And so here we were in 2012, having now to be assessed again a third time with a view to going on the Irish list. So we went ahead with that, and that was a much tougher process, Carlo, than 4 years previously, because I was a lot sicker. And, the sicker you get, the more these tests take out of you. I remember having to go for a liver biopsy, and I was just whacked out. Like, I had to be wheeled down from the room down for this. I was like, God, will I ever get these tests finished? And that carried right through. I mean, I had said it to Professor Egan the previous September, and it wasn't, we were well into 2013 and the tests were still going on. And I remember specifically St. Patrick's weekend 2013, kind of taking a turn where I actually felt I was getting worse and that the end was nigh. I was so sick I couldn't even get myself out of the bed for several days, and tests I was still due to have were cancelled. But somehow I rallied round and was able then to get to the end of that process. But then I was waiting for the surgeon. The Mater had appointed a new surgeon, Karen Redmond. She had a lot of experience in the UK, and as soon as she came over to the Mater, everything kind of took off. But I was waiting for her to come and see me. She was like the final piece in the jigsaw. So she arrived over to see me in July 2013, and she came in and like I was absolutely bet. I was just there on the oxygen. And I was also not just on oxygen, I was on a device called a BiPAP, which it's kind of like, if you can imagine it, like a scuba diving mask.
No?
Yeah, it's a ventilator. It's called a non-invasive ventilator. So it's pushing air in through your lungs. So my own lungs at that stage were gone. So that BiPAP ventilator, which I had been on full time since February 2013, right through I got my transplant, that was kind of my bridge to transplant, because without that technology, I wouldn't have lasted. Now, I had been on that at night for a couple of years, but then once I was on that full time during the day, it was serious. Like, it was really grim then. And I mean, I had heard of stories over the years when I was in and out of hospital that once people went on BiPAP, they might only last days. But anyway, Karen Redmond came over, and I remember she came into the room, sat down to talk to me like I was trying to talk through this mask and oxygen coming in as well. And I just remember saying to her, I have to get this transplant in the next couple of months. And she just looked at me and her face kind of dropped, and she says, Gordon, she says, you have to get this in the next few weeks. And then it kind of hit me. I think it was then that it really hit me, because up to then I kind of just tried to keep going without. I knew I was getting near the end, but I tried to avoid thinking about it, because some of the nurses who looked after me had said to me, you know, they had seen it with other patients, that once they mentally gave in, that the end followed very quickly after that. So I knew that I had to mentally stay strong, no matter how dire the situation was, which it was by then. But what Karen Redmond said like really put it in focus. And then she then got me onto the transplant list. She had to okay it as kind of the final part of the process. And I was put on the Irish list the next morning, Carlo.
Mm. And how soon after you were on that Irish waiting list did you get news that you have a match?
A week.
A week?
1 week, yeah. And that was after 3 years and 2 months almost of being on the Newcastle list. Yeah.
You were deemed the match for a suitable transplant.
Mm.
So it was a week after you were on the list, you got the match, and then when did you actually get the transplant?
It was about 8 days after.
So another week.
No, it was all within the week. I was put on the actual list on the Friday morning, and then I was told about 5 days later that there was a match and that my transplant was going ahead. Now, usually the transplant would go ahead quite quickly once you're told, and a day later would be the longest delayed. But they just said to me, well, we have a match and we're hoping to go ahead with it, but it won't be for a few days, because the person who had passed away, there was I was told there were relatives travelling back from around the world, and there was some delay there. You're not told much, and at that stage you're just so glad to hear that you don't ask. And so there was a few days of delay then until it went ahead on the Sunday. So that would have been about 7 or 8 days after being told.
Quick, isn't it?
Unbelievably quick. I mean, it doesn't really.
You don't have much time then to process everything that's going on, and
you have very little time to process it. And what made it even more crazy at the time was that Newcastle called up the morning. I mean, I remember that night, Karen Redmond came over to see me, the surgeon, Karen Redmond. She came over to see me that Friday. And I was left then having to make that decision that evening about switching on to the Irish list, because I was still on the Newcastle list, and you could not be on 2 transplant lists. you could only be on one. And Newcastle were making reassuring noises and saying to me, you're at top of our priority list. We want to go ahead with the transplant and do it. And then what happened on the Friday morning was bizarre, because I had made the decision that night before, and I didn't sleep a wink, to go on the Irish list. I thought, I've given it everything with Newcastle. I knew at that stage I was very close to the end, like I was just literally hanging on the edge of a cliff. Yeah, I was even past that because I was just in the bed most of the time. But I'd made that decision that night, and that was the hardest. That was even a tougher decision than going on the list in the beginning, because going on a transplant list is a big decision when every part of you doesn't want to have to make that decision. You don't have many choices. You either go on the list and hope you'll get it, or you don't go on the list and you play out your time. And I've seen that happen with a lot of people who didn't go on the list, and many of them aren't around now. And even after transplant, there's no guarantees. There can be complications. So it's a huge decision. But that night then deciding to switch onto the Irish list was really a big one. And I made that decision. And then the next morning, a nurse burst in the door around 8 o'clock in the morning. And she says, Gordon, she says, Newcastle are on the line. There's a match. So I was like, I had made the decision mentally to switch on to the Irish list, but technically I was still on the Newcastle list because it hadn't been signed off in the matter that I was officially on their list. So when the call came through from Newcastle the following morning, that Friday morning, the Saturday morning, I was still on the Newcastle list. And then I was like, well, what do I do now? And nobody seemed to know, because they were like, which list are you on? Are you on the Irish list or are you on the Newcastle list? So then they rang the matter, and the matter said, oh no, he's on our list now. But then at that stage I wasn't really well enough to talk to anyone, but the Newcastle coordinator got quite surprised because they didn't realise what was happening, fully that it was going on the Irish list. But then she called back, Carlo, to say that there was an issue with the match in Newcastle, that it wouldn't be able to go ahead, so they wouldn't fly me over. So, but I kind of had already made my decision, and I thought, luckily I wasn't placed in the position of having to fly over that day, having made my mind to change onto the Irish list. So we went ahead with the Irish list, and it was only about 5 days after that I was told there was a match for me, and the operation went ahead on the Sunday.
So the operation itself, I presume, a long operation?
Oh, it is. Yeah, it is.
10 plus hours, is it? Or?
It is. It's at least 10, yeah. It's about that. And you're knocked out cold, like you don't remember much of it, thankfully.
And so you came through, obviously, the operation. What then was it like post-transplant to take those first deep breaths of air with a new set of lungs? It must have been a crazy feeling.
Well, it is a crazy feeling for people, but in my situation, I wasn't immediately able to do that because I had massive complications during the surgery. So I was unlucky. I bled internally during the transplant. Now, my family were told the actual new lung, they had got my old lungs out, okay, and the new lungs were in. But then this bleeding happened. So they didn't know what caused it, they didn't know why it happened, and they didn't know how to solve it. So I was in a situation then where I was bleeding uncontrollably, and all my family and friends were called in on the Monday into the hospital. They were all in the room surrounding me. Usually they'd have only a couple of people in, and very strict protocols. And there didn't seem to be any hope. And because even though the transplant part of it had been successful, the bleeding had developed, and none of the medical experts, the surgeons involved, knew what caused it. It was unusual. Most people don't have that. They just, they wake up from the transplant and they are able to take in those breaths immediately. So I didn't have that for a while. So I was bleeding anyway, and they said was we don't know how to stop it, and my family were basically told we'll have to switch off everything in a few hours
if it doesn't stop bleeding. If you didn't,
yeah.
Stop
Well,
bleeding.
they had got like my blood type from several different hospitals in Dublin, and they were kind of running out of blood for my blood type, and it often makes me think the importance of donating blood. It's something people don't even think about a lot of the time. But I'm so grateful for that when I look back that people did donate blood, because I got a lot of blood. I was told I got something crazy like 5 times my body weight, because they were putting in all this blood apparently, and it was just bleeding out and nothing was working. But then not too long after, the doctors said that about switching everything off, and like they were even talking about my funeral. My own family, my sister's birthday was the following Thursday, and she was distraught that the funeral was going to be on her birthday, and they were all like preparing for a funeral. But then miraculously, and it was nothing short of a miracle by all accounts, I started to stop bleeding. Now, also just to say this to you, a few people from around Coote Hall contacted a guy who I knew growing up in Coote Hall. His name is John Dowd. They used to run the post office in Coote Hall, and I didn't even realise this growing up in Coote Hall, that John had a cure to stop bleeding. So he was contacted and he did his thing, and it wasn't too long after that, I'm told, that the bleeding started to stop. And like the doctors and experts in the matter, they didn't know why it stopped. They didn't know why it started, and they still don't know why it stopped. But the most important thing is that it did. It stopped. And then once it stopped, they were all, excited, all the nurses and everything, and there was a possibility I might actually survive. And that's what happened then. And I told I was brought back down again to surgery on the Wednesday, and I had to be closed up, because I wasn't closed up after the transplant itself, which doesn't happen normally with transplants. So I was brought down and closed up, and I had my gallbladder removed as well, and a couple of other things. So that was on the Wednesday, and then on the Thursday, which was 4 days after my operation, I just started flickering my eyes open, and my mum and sister were there, and the excitement was unbelievable in the room. But this is why when you asked earlier about taking in those breaths, and I have friends who had that experience straight away, but that wasn't how it went for me. I didn't get to experience that immediately. But I couldn't even lift a finger when I woke up. As one of the doctors looked after me said, it's like you've been hit by a bomb. I was on dialysis. I was in ICU for 4 weeks after my operation, and then moved to high dependency for another 5 weeks. I remember about a year after my own transplant, going in to visit a friend of mine with CF who had a transplant, and he was sitting up in ICU the day after, sitting up there chatting away, and was moved out of ICU then 2 days after his transplant. But I really had to learn to walk again. I was just wiped out. I was on dialysis for I don't know how long, and it was really a really tough recovery. It was really grim. I remember I had a ventilator in my mouth initially, and I was it was really painful. I remember just trying to pull it out, and a nurse kept coming over to me. I had a nurse in the room with me in ICU, and she said, no, you can't do that. And I was like, God, you wouldn't do this to a dog. Like that's how tough it was in in that early phase of recovery. But somehow I battled through that. I don't know how. I just hung in there and got through it. And gradually they got me up, got me moving again. And like I had a lot of muscle wastage from years of being sick and being so unwell. Like I think looking back on it, Carlo, I was probably too sick going into the operation. You know, we talked earlier about that initial call with Newcastle where I came home relieved that it hadn't gone ahead. But by the time I did get the transplant eventually, I was fully relieved as well as terrified going into the operation. But I knew going into the operation, you know, in July 2013 when I finally had it, that there was nowhere else to go. I had nowhere else to turn. There was literally no other option on earth, only in for that operation, come what may. And with the complications that developed afterwards, you know, I was very lucky. I was, you know, lucky on the double to be here.
And so afterwards, adjusting to life post-transplant, what obviously adjustments had you to make? You could do a lot more things, obviously, that you couldn't have done prior.
Oh, totally. I mean, the difference. I mean, once I recovered from that initial phase, having had the complications, then I gradually got stronger and got back on my feet, and it's just a whole new world. I mean, being able to breathe again, like you asked me about earlier. I mean, that came then, and just not to have to wear the oxygen. That was everything to me at the time. You know, when you'd had that experience for 2 years, you know,
every day.
You know, it was the feeling of normality. You know, I can be normal again, because one of the things about living with a serious illness like CF is that it takes normality from you, and your ability to lead a normal life is gradually, it's chipped away at to the point then where you don't have it. So to get that back and that ability to breathe fully and to get out and just like get out on a bicycle and go for a cycle or a walk, I mean, that wasn't possible. I couldn't even get up the stairs for nigh on a year before my transplant. And even before that, I was struggling up and down, puffed out. And I can remember working in Dublin even before I went on the list. And I'd go up the stairs and I'd have to stop, just totally breathless. So to now be able to bound up the stairs, I remember I had a night in Dublin for all the nurses who looked after me in Vincent's. That was about a year after my transplant, and good friends of mine and family and relatives. And I remember it was the place I had it was 3 flights of steps up, and I was able to just fly up those steps without feeling it. And the nurses were all remarking on it. They were saying some of them were breathless getting to the top. But that was a great thing. And just the simple things, to be able to do the simple things. But it was an adjustment, because when you've been, you know, living like that for several years where you're just existing, you know, you then have to transition to living, because you can now live and do things again, like being able to fly away.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't leave the country for 7 years, you know, between 2007 and 2014. I remember being in Spain in 2007, and I was supposed to be wearing my oxygen at the time, going around walking, and I didn't want to at that time. I remember going up the stairs, going up hills. I couldn't even get up hills, and I ended up, we had to come back early. And I went straight from the airport to the hospital and was quite unwell at the time. So, you know, then after transplant, to be able to turn up at an airport, just to be able to do that, turn up at an airport and fly anywhere. I mean, that's something I don't take for granted now, because I didn't have that experience for many years before my transplant. Do you think CF would have defined you in your early years? Like, were you Gordon with cystic fibrosis, or what would your thoughts on that be now? Do you think you were defined by CF? I don't think so in the early days. I kind of think I was Gordon, who didn't want to admit he had cystic fibrosis, because you just want to be normal and have a normal life. And I suppose, I didn't allow myself for that. Maybe I was hard on myself because going to school, playing sports, I wasn't the best on that front. But, the cystic fibrosis was always there, even though I didn't get really sick with it until I was 21 or 2. So it was there, and I was compromised physically with that. Even though everything looked fine on the outside and normal. So, but I didn't let it define me. But then when you get to the point where you're not able to lead a normal life, you're not working, at that stage, it does define you, even though you don't like it, because you're stripped of your ability to live normally. And I mean, I always tried not to let it define me, but it's definitely part of the scene at that stage.
And for people like yourself that come out the other side of the transplant and that have dealt with cystic fibrosis all their life, would there be a sense of being disenfranchised to the illness, like they don't belong? Like for so long they've been a CFer, if you like, and now you're no longer in that category. Do some people have probably not the best way of explaining it, but would they have a longing that they miss those days, even though they wouldn't, like yourself, you wouldn't miss those days, obviously, but is there a sense of, I do have, some parts of it that I miss?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Carlo. It's very individual, where you have people who were living with cystic fibrosis since they were very young, sick with it. That's all they knew.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of...
And that then, like with my friend Marie, that made it difficult for people like that to make that decision to go on the transplant waiting list. But then you also have people like Marie who were sick since they were young, who do go on the list and get the transplant, but they can revert to being the patient, because that's a very hard thing to shift. If you've been the sick person, since you were a child,
all your life, yeah,
and then you get the transplant and you don't need to live that life anymore because you have this new freedom, you can breathe properly. You don't have to spend all this time every day doing physiotherapy to clear out mucus and phlegm, because you don't have it anymore after transplant. You have these new healthy lungs. But some people psychologically revert to type, to use the expression, because that's all they knew. And that's where the psychological part of transplant comes into play. It is a major adjustment psychologically, to fully come to terms with the fact that, that you now have somebody else's lungs inside you. And it can be a huge challenge, because when you've lived with cystic fibrosis and have been sick with it over many years, you know your own lungs and you get to know them very well. So you kind of know what works, in terms of how to look after yourself. With medication, for instance, like they throw everything at people with CF in terms of antibiotics and that. And you kind of learn over the years, well, that's not working for me. So, I might not take that, even though you're taking everything else. But after transplant, none of that applies, because you can't afford to take any risk. You're trying to get to grips with these new lungs, and it feels different, and physically it feels different, and everything that you're told to take, you take it rigidly, but then you have the psychological transition that, well, I'm free now to do things. I can go, I can get a job, I can travel again. And I'm lucky in the sense that I did have that experience growing up to fall back on. So it did stand to me in the long run, even though when I did get sick initially in my early 20s, the fact that I kind of felt very new to it and, didn't know a huge amount about it. Now, my parents explained it to me and all that, but it was kind of, it was very much a normal environment growing up. They didn't dwell on it and they didn't make a big thing of it. So I didn't feel any different to anybody else, but of course I was. So that is a difficult psychological adjustment after transplant. And I do have a couple of friends who I think did fall back into that kind of sick person thing after transplant and, developed complications and aren't around now. But the majority I know who've had a transplant have made the adjustment and embraced it and are doing absolutely fabulously and leading full lives.
Brilliant, yeah. Just before we wrap up, I just want to touch on the organ donation because in Ireland we don't have an opt-out system yet. We're trying to legislate for it, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, no, there was a bill brought in must be about 3 years ago now, into the Dáil, and they haven't legislated yet to bring in the opt-out system. So we still have the voluntary opt-in system where you have to sign up to be an organ donor, and you can do that by ticking your driving licence or signing up with the Irish Kidney Association, and there's an app as well, or just having the conversation with your closest relatives, and that's something I'd encourage everybody to do, just to talk about it. And it's a tricky one, Carlo, because nobody wants to talk about death or about their mortality, and in this country we prefer not to think about it. I suppose it's the same all over the world. But it's really important that people do express their wishes if they'd like to be an organ donor, potentially in the worst case scenario. But what would really transform the situation in Ireland, I think, would be the opt-out system. So under that, everyone would be considered an organ donor unless they have expressly stated that they do not want to be an organ donor. So at the moment, we kind of have the opposite of that, where it's opt-in. And it is incredible how many people never think about it. Like, I remember being on the train up to Dublin not too long after my own transplant, and I was chatting to a couple of lads here locally from Boyle that I knew to see, and they were asking me about the transplant. They'd heard about it, and then I just said to them, have you signed up yourselves to be an organ donor? And they said no. And I said, oh, how come? Would you consider it? And they said, well, never really thought about it. Or how would you go about it? So there isn't really enough awareness, and I think it's vital that people do consider it. And I think throughout the COVID pandemic too, maybe it kind of got pushed more into the background. Like, I know the year before the pandemic, 2019, we had 274 organ transplants in Ireland, and last year, 2021, there were 203, and we have over 600 people currently waiting on the list. So a lot of those people will die if they don't get a transplant.
Yeah, the opt-out system is, I think, the only way.
It definitely is. And when you look at the experiences of other countries, I know they have it in Belgium, for instance, and the rate of organ transplantation has increased there due to the opt-out system. And it's only fair, I think, that people, who are very sick and on a transplant waiting list get that opportunity. And in Belgium, it seems most people do get that opportunity, and I'd love to see it brought in here as soon as possible, but it is working its way through the Oireachtas, as they say. Yeah. And
might do a few zigzags, I'm sure.
It might, yeah, but I think it's on track to come in.
So to round things up, Gordon, one thing I like to ask at the end of our conversations is there anything I haven't asked you that maybe I should have?
That's a really great question, Carlo. I think a potential question you might have asked me is what advice or encouragement I'd have for people battling cystic fibrosis or waiting for a transplant or any serious illness. Because looking back on my own experience, it can be quite isolating when you're battling a severe illness. It's not something that people always want to go out and talk about. You know, you're just trying to get on with it and try and keep things as normal as possible. So there's a tendency to be quite private about it. And then the support may not always be accessible for you. So in that scenario, I would emphasise, you know, the importance of hope. And luckily in the world of transplant, there is hope that you might get your transplant, and that's what keeps you going. And in any situation, not to despair, not to give up, which is easier said than done. But you know, we don't control a lot of things in life, and the only thing we can control is how we cope with our own situation. And my experience of seeing others over the years was that those who kind of didn't help themselves struggled. So just do your best to help yourself by remaining positive and hanging in there, because you never know when your luck will turn.
That's great, yeah. Well, listen, Gordon, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. You've given a lot of insight into the world of cystic fibrosis and transplants, specifically lung transplant, and I think a lot of people will get some inspiration from the chat. So thank you very, very much for taking the time.
You're welcome, Carlo. Thank you for having me on.
So that's it for this episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you like the content, we'd really appreciate it if you could share it. You can follow us on Facebook by searching for Voices of Boyle, and you can also contact us on our website by visiting voicesofboyle.com. We're always looking for new guests, so if you'd like to be on the show, or if you know someone who you'd like to join us, please reach out to us via our Facebook page or website. Thanks very much, and we'll chat to you again soon.